No refrigerator, no freezer, just salt, wind, smoke, and centuries of knowledge. And yet, Chinese households were preserving pork, duck, and fish for entire seasons, long before modern technology ever existed. How did they do it? That is exactly what we are going to break down today, method by method, and some of these techniques are going to genuinely surprise you. Before we get into it, think about this for a second. Fresh meat left out at room temperature in summer can start spoiling within just a few hours. A few hours. And yet families across China were storing meat for months at a time, sometimes through entire seasons, with zero electricity and no cold chain. That is not luck. That is a system refined over thousands of years, and we are going to walk through every piece of it. Let us start by setting the scene, because the stakes here are actually pretty serious. In ancient and traditional China, meat was precious. Slaughtering a pig or a duck was a significant event, not something that happened every week. When an animal was killed, every single piece of it needed to be used, and ideally, it needed to last. Wasting meat was not just inconvenient. In many communities, it could mean real hardship. Now add the climate. Southern China, places like Guangdong and Hunan, can be brutally hot and humid for large portions of the year. That kind of environment is practically a paradise for bacteria. Without any way to cool food down, fresh meat left unattended would begin its rapid decline almost immediately. Flies, microbes, humidity, warmth, all of it working together to destroy food fast. In northern China, winters were cold enough to help, but summers were still a problem. And even in the north, people needed reliable methods they could apply consistently, not just hope that the weather cooperated. So, across different regions, different climates, and different culinary traditions, Chinese communities developed an interconnected system of preservation techniques. Not one single answer, but a whole toolkit. Salt, air, smoke, fermentation, fat, timing. Each method had its own logic, and many of them were layered together for maximum effect. And the first tool in that entire system, the one that underlies almost everything else, is something so simple it might surprise you. Salt is where everything begins. If you want to understand how Chinese meat preservation works, you need to understand why salt is so powerful, and it comes down to a process called osmosis. When you pack meat heavily with salt, the salt draws moisture out of the meat cells. Water moves from inside the meat toward the salt on the surface, trying to equalize the concentration. The result is that the meat loses a significant amount of its internal moisture content. Why does that matter? Because bacteria need water to survive and multiply. Microorganisms that cause spoilage are largely dependent on available moisture in the food they are breaking down. When you dramatically reduce that moisture, you are essentially pulling the rug out from under them. Their ability to grow, reproduce, and decompose the meat is severely limited. Spoilage slows down dramatically, and in some cases, stops almost entirely. In Chinese preservation traditions, the salting process is taken seriously. The meat is not just lightly seasoned. It is rubbed aggressively, packed thoroughly, sometimes buried in salt and left to sit for days. This deep salting ensures that the moisture reduction is comprehensive, not just surface level. The interior of the meat needs to be affected, not just the outside layer. This is the foundation of almost every single preservation method that we are going to talk about. Whether the meat is going to be dried, smoked, fermented, or sealed in fat, it almost always starts with salt. The other techniques build on top of this base. And speaking of building on top of salt, the next method takes that salted meat and hands it directly to nature itself to finish the job. In northern China, winter is an ally. The temperatures drop, the air becomes dry, and the conditions become almost perfect for a preservation technique called Ziran Feng Gan, which translates directly to natural air drying. The concept is straightforward, but the results are remarkable. Salted meat, usually pork but sometimes lamb or other cuts depending on the region, is hung outdoors or in well-ventilated spaces during the coldest months of the year. The cold air does two critical things simultaneously. First, it continues to pull moisture out of the meat at a slow and steady rate. Dehydration is the goal here, reducing the water content of the meat until it reaches a level where bacteria simply cannot thrive. Second, the cold temperature itself inhibits bacterial growth. Most of the microorganisms responsible for spoilage are far less active at low temperatures. Cold slows them down, and dry air combined with cold temperatures can almost stop them entirely. What you end up with after weeks of Feng Gan is meat that is transformed. The texture becomes firm, sometimes quite hard. The flavors become concentrated and intense, because moisture loss means that whatever was in the meat, the fats, the proteins, the natural compounds, all become more pronounced. The color deepens. The aroma develops in ways that fresh meat simply cannot match, and the shelf life extends dramatically. Properly air-dried meat from the northern Chinese tradition can last for months, stored in cool, dry conditions without any refrigeration at all. This technique is practical, elegant, and completely dependent on understanding the local environment. Northern Chinese winters provided exactly the right conditions, and communities took full advantage of them. But in southern China, where winters are shorter and milder, air drying needed a bit more help. That help came in the form of one of the most iconic preserved meats in Chinese cuisine. Laroo, pronounced lapyuk in Cantonese and Laroo in Mandarin, is arguably the most famous preserved meat in Chinese culinary tradition. It is pork specifically. And while the northern air drying technique relies primarily on cold and salt, Laroo adds an entire flavor profile to the preservation process. The preparation begins with salting, as almost everything does. The pork, often belly cuts with a good fat-to-meat ratio, is rubbed down with salt and left to cure. But then comes what makes Laroo distinctive. The salted pork is marinated in a mixture that typically includes soy sauce, sugar, and huangzhu, which is Chinese rice wine. This marinade soaks into the meat over a period of days, infusing it with a complex combination of savory, slightly sweet, and subtly alcoholic flavors. The soy sauce adds depth and color. The sugar contributes to a characteristic glossy, slightly caramelized surface that develops during the drying process. The rice wine, as we will get into more later, does more than just add flavor. After the marinating period, the pork is hung to dry, traditionally outdoors or in shaded, breezy locations. The timing is everything. Laroo is traditionally made during the cool, dry season, which in Guangdong and surrounding regions typically means the period from late autumn through winter. This is not coincidental. The cool temperatures and lower humidity during these months create conditions where the meat can dry properly without spoiling during the process. Making Laroo in summer would be a disaster because the meat would rot before it could dry. The finished product is something extraordinary. The color is a deep, rich mahogany. The texture is firm, but not brittle. The flavor is savory with a subtle sweetness, and there is a complexity that comes from the combination of the marinade, the salt, and the slow transformation that happens during drying, steamed over rice, sliced thin and stir-fried, or added to clay pot dishes. Laroo is beloved across Chinese cuisine, and its distinct flavor cannot be replicated by simply seasoning fresh meat. But salt and air are not the only tools in this preservation system. In some of China's most distinctive culinary regions, fire and smoke are brought into the equation. Shunrou, or smoked meat, takes preservation into a completely different sensory dimension. While salting and air drying work through dehydration and environment control, smoking adds a layer of active chemical protection to the meat's surface. Wood smoke is not just aromatic. It contains compounds that actively inhibit microbial growth. When meat is exposed to smoke, the smoke deposits a range of chemical compounds onto and into the surface of the meat. Some of these compounds, including phenols and aldehydes, have genuine antimicrobial properties. They create a hostile environment for bacteria on the surface of the meat. Additionally, the heat from the smoking process drives more moisture out of the meat, compounding the dehydration effect that started with salting. The surface of smoked meat becomes drier and tougher, forming a kind of protective barrier that further slows spoilage. In regions like Hunan and Sichuan, Shunrou is deeply embedded in culinary culture. These regions have developed smoking traditions that are specific and intentional. The type of wood or material used for smoking matters enormously. Some communities use cypress or pine, others use rice straw, tea leaves, or even sugarcane bagasse. Each fuel source produces smoke with a slightly different chemical composition, and imparts different flavors to the meat. Hunan smoked meats tend to have a bold, deeply smoky character that holds up to the region's famously strong flavors. In these regions, smoking is almost never done in isolation. It is layered on top of salting. The meat is salted first, sometimes also marinated, and then smoked. This combination creates a multi-layered defense against spoilage. Salt reduces moisture from within. Smoke treats the surface with antimicrobial compounds and drives out more moisture. The combined effect is meat that can survive in conditions that would destroy fresh meat almost immediately. And while smoke is being used on the outside, something equally important was being applied to preserve flavor on the inside. What goes into the marinade matters more than you might think. We touched on Huangju, or Chinese rice wine, when we talked about Laroo, but it deserves its own explanation because the science behind it is fascinating and often overlooked. Soy sauce and rice wine are commonly understood as flavor ingredients in Chinese cooking. What is less commonly known is that both play active roles in preservation. Alcohol, even in relatively modest concentrations, disrupts the cellular membranes of bacteria. It is not a perfect preservative on its own, but when combined with salt and the dehydration effect of drying, it contributes meaningfully to creating an environment where microorganisms struggle to thrive. The alcohol content in Huangju is not industrial level, but it is enough to add a layer of protection, particularly in those early days after the meat has been marinated and before it has fully dried. Soy sauce contributes through its salt content, which is already very high, and through its acidity. The fermentation process that creates soy sauce results in a product that has both salinity and a slightly acidic character. Bacteria that might otherwise begin breaking down meat are inhibited by this combination. Soy sauce also creates an environment on the surface of the meat that, when dried, forms a protective coating. Together, when you combine the heavy salting of the initial cure, the antimicrobial effect of alcohol from the rice wine, the salinity and acidity of soy sauce, and then follow all of that with drying, you have stacked multiple lines of defense against spoilage. Each element alone is incomplete. Together, they form something robust. Traditional Chinese preservation methods intuitively understood this synergy, even without the benefit of modern microbiology to explain it. But there is another technique that goes in a completely different direction, sealing meat away from the very air around it. This method is one of the more visually striking preservation techniques, and it works on a principle that is almost the opposite of drying. Instead of removing moisture and exposing meat to air, this approach seals the meat entirely away from air, using rendered fat. The process works like this. Cooked meat, usually pork but sometimes duck or other fatty meats, is prepared and then submerged completely in its own rendered fat or in separately prepared lard. The fat, while still liquid and warm, surrounds the meat entirely. As the fat cools, it solidifies. What you are left with is meat encased in a solid block of fat, completely isolated from the air around it. The preservation logic here is about oxygen. Many of the microorganisms responsible for spoilage are aerobic, meaning they require oxygen to function. Cut off their oxygen supply, and their ability to break down the meat is dramatically reduced. The solidified fat acts as a seal, preventing oxygen from reaching the meat inside. Stored in a cool location, this method can keep cooked meat edible for weeks, sometimes longer. This technique has parallels in other culinary traditions around the world, most notably the French method of confit, where duck legs are cooked and stored in their own fat. The fact that such similar methods developed independently in different cultures is a testament to how logical the underlying principle is. When you understand that oxygen feeds spoilage organisms, storing meat in an oxygen-blocking medium becomes an obvious solution. What is perhaps less obvious is that some Chinese preservation techniques do not fight bacteria at all. Instead, they recruit a different kind of bacteria to do the work for them. Fermented meats occupy a fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive place in Chinese preservation. Where most methods focus on stopping or slowing microbial activity, fermentation deliberately introduces and cultivates certain types of bacteria. The goal is to let the right bacteria dominate the environment so thoroughly that harmful bacteria never get a foothold. The process typically involves salted meat being stored in conditions that favor the growth of beneficial lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria, as they grow and multiply, produce lactic acid as a byproduct of their metabolism. Lactic acid is effective at lowering the pH of the environment, making it more acidic. And in an acidic environment, most of the bacteria responsible for spoilage and foodborne illness cannot survive or reproduce. This is not a random or uncontrolled process. Traditional fermented meat producers understood, through generations of accumulated knowledge, what conditions needed to be present for successful fermentation. The right amount of salt inhibits the harmful bacteria from the start, while allowing the salt-tolerant beneficial bacteria to thrive. The right temperature encourages fermentation to proceed at the right speed. Too warm and dangerous bacteria might get a head start. Too cold, and fermentation stalls entirely. The result is meat that has been transformed chemically. The texture changes. The flavor becomes more complex, with a characteristic sourness that is valued in the regions where these products originate. The shelf life extends significantly because the acidic environment created by fermentation is itself a preservation mechanism. Some fermented meat traditions in southwestern China, for example, produce products that are tangy, pungent, and deeply savory in ways that fresh meat simply cannot be. Fermentation takes time and knowledge, but it is one of the most powerful tools in the preservation system. And tying all of these methods together is something that is easy to overlook, but absolutely fundamental. The season in which preservation happens is not accidental. Everything we have discussed, the salting, the air drying, the smoking, the marinating, it all comes together at a specific time of year. And that timing is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate strategy. Traditional Chinese meat preservation is deeply seasonal, and the season that makes almost everything possible is winter. In late autumn, as temperatures drop and humidity levels fall, households across China would begin the process of slaughtering animals and beginning preservation. This timing aligns with the natural calendar of farming communities. Animals that had been raised through the growing season were ready, the harvest had been completed, and the weather was shifting into the conditions that made preservation viable. Cool, dry air is essential for Ziran, Fenggan, and Laroo. If you attempt to dry and cure meat in warm, humid conditions, the meat will begin to spoil before it can dry sufficiently. The race between dehydration and bacterial growth is won only when the environmental conditions favor drying. Winter provides exactly that. Temperatures low enough to slow bacterial growth, humidity low enough to allow steady dehydration without creating a moist surface that encourages mold. In this sense, winter itself was functioning as a refrigerator, not in the mechanical sense, but in its effect. Lower temperatures extended the window of safety during which meat could be processed and preserved. Communities were not fighting against the climate. They were using it as an active tool. The seasons dictated the preservation calendar, and that calendar was deeply embedded in the cultural rhythms of Chinese rural life. Festivals, family gatherings, gifts of food between households, the sharing of Laroo and Lachang during the Lunar New Year period, all of these traditions grew out of the practical reality of preservation timing. Cold weather was not a hardship to endure. It was a resource to be used wisely. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about all of these ancient techniques is what happened when refrigeration finally arrived. You might expect these methods to disappear. They did not. Modern refrigeration is widely available across China today. Cold chain logistics, electric freezers, and supermarket infrastructure mean that fresh meat can be purchased and stored without any of the ancient techniques we have discussed. And yet, Laroo, Lachang, smoked meats, fermented preparations, they remain staples, not because people have to use them, but because people want to. The reason these methods have survived is that they do not just preserve meat, they transform it. The process of salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting creates flavors and textures that refrigerated fresh meat cannot replicate. Laroo steamed over rice has a depth and richness that fresh pork simply does not have. The slight sweetness from the sugar in the marinade, the savory intensity from weeks of slow drying, the concentrated umami that develops during the curing process. These are qualities that only time and salt and air can create. Refrigeration keeps meat fresh. Preservation makes it into something else entirely. There is also a cultural dimension that cannot be separated from the food itself. The making of Laroo before the Lunar New Year, the sharing of smoked meats during winter festivals, the family traditions around fermented preparations in various regions, these practices carry meaning beyond nutrition. They connect people to their heritage, to the rhythms of seasons and harvests that shaped Chinese communities for thousands of years. Preservation methods are not just food science. They are culture preserved in salt and smoke and time. So when you see strips of Laroo hanging in a market window, or smell the distinct aroma of shun roo in a Hunan restaurant, or taste the complex savoriness of a fermented preparation from the Southwest, you are encountering something that stretches back across centuries. A system of knowledge developed out of necessity, refined through experience, and maintained through choice. The tools changed. Electricity arrived. Supply chains modernized. But the preserved meats endure because what they offer is irreplaceable. The next time you encounter a piece of Laroo or lechong, take a moment to consider what went into it. Not just the ingredients or the recipe, but the accumulated knowledge of how to work with nature rather than against it. How to read the season. How to apply salt at the right moment. How to use cold air and time and smoke to transform something that would otherwise spoil into something worth savoring months later. That is what Chinese meat preservation is. Not just a method, a relationship with food, with climate, and with time itself. And if you think preserving meat was impressive, wait until you see the everyday foods Chinese households rely on that can sit untouched for years and still be ready the moment they're needed.